Well, welcome this afternoon. We're so glad to see everyone on this pretty afternoon and a little bit of a break from the heat. So it's a nice day to be out and with a little breeze. And I hope everyone's doing well today. Welcome to the East Tennessee Historical Society and the East Tennessee History Center for our Brown Bag lecture today. My name's Lisa Oakley, and I'm Curator of Education here. And just excited to see you and to welcome you and to also let you know that if you are not a member of the East Tennessee Historical Society, we would love for you to consider becoming a member. There's information out at the front desk, and Tim can take care of that today for you, as well as you can do it online. And for those of you all that are with us via Zoom, we will be posting a link to our website to be able to look at that, as well as you can go in and see information about our upcoming events and lectures. And our next lecture, and I always have to cheat, and if you are a member, you receive this great card, so you can go ahead and save dates on your calendar. We would also love for you to join our email list, and you can get information about doing that. There's slips out on the donation box, or ask Tim, and he'll be glad to get you on our email list, and there's a link on our website. But we will let folks know by email, also on our Facebook page. So there's lots of ways to find out what we have going on, but we do so appreciate our members that are partners with us and help us do what we do educationally and curatorially with our exhibits and collections. But we do have our next lecture is on Thursday, July 28th. Now this will be an evening lecture at 7 p.m. with Bo Roberts, who was very involved in the 1982 World's Fair. And please take a look at the exhibit today if you have not seen that yet. And come back and visit then again at 7 p.m. on Thursday, July the 28th. For Knoxville Took on the World, Lessons Learned, and Remembering the Joy. And so he's going to be reminiscing. He's also recently published a book. So that will be on July 28th. And then on August 8th, William Isom will be here to talk to us about the 8th of August, East Tennessee's Emancipation Day. And so we're just really honored to have William on that day to talk about that important commemoration and that history behind the August 8th Emancipation Day that is endemic here to East Tennessee, as well as Kentucky and other states where they have recorded that Jubilee Day for the African American community. So, but with further ado, I will introduce our speaker for today. Dr. William Hardy is well known to many of us here at the East Tennessee Historical Society, and if you've been involved with the Historical Society for a number of years, he's actually done lectures on different topics on Lincoln, with the Lincoln film that we did with our Lincoln exhibit more years ago than I want to count, probably. But also he's talked about the fire on Gay Street. That's a research specialty of his. But Dr. Hardy is a professor at Lincoln Memorial University, assistant professor and Lincoln Scholar there. He is a graduate with his PhD from the University of Tennessee History Department, and he is an alumna of our staff here at the East Tennessee Historical Society, and has worked a lot with teachers across the state, and also is an educator himself for the secondary level. So we're just really honored to have this Kentuckian take us on and adopt us as his new home. Now you've been here for what, about 25 years or 20?
Whoa, no, don't date me that much. 18.
18, well, getting close to 20. And we'll be here for many more years, and we're just really proud of him and so thankful that he's here to present today. And I'll let him introduce his topic and to tell you more about it. So again, welcome, and just let us know if you have any questions at the end. We will have question and answer.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Lisa, for the introduction. I've almost been here now in Tennessee as long as I spent in Kentucky, where I was born. It's been 18 years. I spent 8 1/4 years here at the East Tennessee Historical Society. While it coincided with me working on my dissertation, so there were some days that were very tough around here, and I was pretty grouchy. But I'm still enjoyed a lot of the work that we did here, that I did with the Teaching American History grants, working with Lisa, but especially the National History Day program. One of the things that the Historical Society does, yes, you can see the face here in the museum is a very prominent part, but I'll plug the education. The work that the East Tennessee Historical Society and Lisa Oakley does is we got out with National History Day. That's a program where basically, if you think about, you know what science fair is? You think about those old boards. History Day is kind of like that for history, except for students not only create exhibits, middle and high school students across East Tennessee and well across the nation. It's a national program. But they also create documentaries. They create websites. They write research papers, and they perform. And it's something really to get students excited. Certain mini vehicles to get them excited into history, and it's just a lot of fun. And we had a lot of national winners as a result during those years. I'm very proud of. But today, I'm here to talk about basically what was my dissertation research. Usually a project is a little more expansive than what I did. I focused on nearly 2.5 years at the end of Tennessee's Reconstruction period after the American Civil War, a period that followed a governor in this state who is very well known, William Parson Brownlow. And my focus was on DeWitt Center, his successor in the position. Not a lot was known about Center. As a matter of fact, there's a reason there's not a lot known about him. He didn't leave behind any personal papers. Really, about all you can find is his more public record. And I doubt anyone's going to ever be able to really write a good biography. If it is, it's going to be like 20 pages maybe or so. But what I'm going to talk about today is to get into Center, who I kind of label a great sphinx, because there's really not much to be known about him. There's not much that's been left. And with Center, I'm going to look at him today. He has been portrayed in history as sort of a one-dimensional figure. In the histories that have been written, and there's not been many histories written in, 70 years. This is the last book written on Tennessee's Reconstruction period, a thorough study of Reconstruction. 72 years to be exact. And even in this book, most of it is taken up by that fella on the right of the screen. That is William Parson Brownlow. Brownlow just sucks the oxygen out of Tennessee's Reconstruction story, and he's kind of interesting. Love him, hate him, hate him, love him, hate him, hate him, hate him. A lot of people, I think there's a lot to be done still on Brownlow. We need a new study on him, indeed. But Center came at the end of Brownlow's administration, and quite frankly, if you want to just kind of get into the historical context as history is taught Reconstruction, and again, it's outdated. It was seen as a tragic era in which the victors, what had become these Unionists who won in the South, got control of the state governments at the end of the Civil War and thoroughly punished the rebels and those who sympathized with the Confederate States of America. And Brownlow fits the mode as one of these evil, vindictive politicians who thoroughly punished the defeated Confederacy and those who fought for the Confederacy and those who sympathized with some draconian measures. Most notably, at the ballot box. At the end of the American Civil War, the Unionists, when they won the war, gained control of the state government in early January 1865. Brownlow comes in, he's installed as governor, and the ballot box is going to determine the immediate future of Tennessee. Who's going to get to vote? Well, it's simple. Namely, any white male over the age of 21 who did not fight for the Confederacy or who did not sympathize with the Confederacy, you were going to vote. If you fought for the Confederacy or sympathized, you were not going to be eligible. You're going to be immediately disfranchised. Well, surprise, surprise, that's disfranchised the majority of Tennessee's eligible voters. So what we have is a minority party coming into power under Brownlow. And this subject is actually very relevant to today, and elections, and who controls the elections. When Brownlow comes in, they immediately start passing laws. They call it Brownlowism, his radical Republican Party, not really to be mistaken with the Republican Party in the North. These are two very different strains of republicanism. There was no Republican Party, quite frankly, to begin with in the South at the beginning of the war. So these victorious Unionists, those who support the Union, are styled as Republicans at the end of the American Civil War. And so they immediately start passing these franchise laws. Who gets the certificate? And again, it goes straight to those who had supported the Union, those who did not support the Confederacy or fight for it. The state legislature immediately went ahead and acted on emancipation, emancipated the slaves in Tennessee before the 13th Amendment was ratified and became part of our United States Constitution in December 1865. So we're here in Tennessee first to emancipate slaves. They start issuing commissioners of registration for the various counties across Tennessee. These are judicial officers appointed by Brownlow who are going to oversee the registration process. Who gets to vote? So you can guarantee the only people who are going to be voting are those who did not fight for the Confederacy or support it. Those who are staunch advocates of Brownlow. And I stress that second point because as Reconstruction began to unfold, even some Unionists began to break with Brownlow. They saw his policies as too draconian, too punitive. And as they broke with Brownlow, Brownlow informed his commissioners of registration that those opponents, even though they were Unionists during the war, they'd supported the war, they are to be disfranchised. So Brownlow's policies became a little bit more draconian as it went. To ensure his party's support, that it continued a minority party in power, Tennessee moved towards enfranchising African Americans in Tennessee. Again, 21 age or older male, as the law is. And suddenly 40,000 African Americans are now enfranchised. That is more advanced. Tennessee becomes the first southern state to enfranchise African Americans before the 15th Amendment has even been passed, drafted in Congress, passed, and even ratified, which that is until it moves out of Congress in 1868. That's a year after Tennessee enfranchised African Americans, and doesn't become law until 1870 when the number of states required to ratify it. Resistance started building up throughout the state to Brownlow's regime. Ku Klux Klan, other paramilitary organizations attacking African Americans, intimidating them from voting, attacking radicals, the Republicans, the supporters of Brownlow, intimidating them. There are murders, hangings, it's a murder. And suddenly Brownlow calls out his own state militia to put down this resistance. And the state militia not only tasked to go after these paramilitary organizations like the Ku Klux Klan, but they're also posted at the ballot box. Now the Klan, wisely for them, they went underground the moment the state militia went out. So what happens you get is the state militia is called out. Huge number of men are put into service to put down these paramilitary organizations who go in hiding. They got nobody to prosecute, nobody to go after, and this begins to be a financial burden. So these paramilitary organizations were actually quite wise to go into hiding. It just adds into this financial drain on the state. And the state is bleeding money. They're passing numerous legislations trying to rebuild the railroads, the internal improvements, the infrastructure, which is very expensive. But there's also a lot of corruption. That's also a tale of this older story of Reconstruction. Corruption ran north, south, the west, Democrat, Republican. This is the age of massive corruption. A lot of money around. The story of carpetbaggers coming from the north. A lot of people who had fought for the Union, many, especially here in Knoxville in East Tennessee, those, a lot of from Ohio regiments who was here in 1863 when East Tennessee was liberated from rebel control. They had fought here. They came back at the end of the war. If you read their letters, they write about, East Tennessee. It was a beautiful country, and a lot of these were single men at the end of the war, and they were looking for opportunity, and they came here. Actually, Republicans, Brownlow welcomed them with open arms. Even some former rebels, because they came with money. They came with energy, ideas to help develop this region. The older stories talk about them exploiting the region's natural resources, plundering the region of its wealth. Well, they did contribute to a lot to the advancement of this region, which, especially in this area, starts taking off in the late 1860s, 1870s, 1880s, before it stalls out when you get into the early 20th century. So there's a lot of this sort of negative interpretation on Brownlow, and like I said, it sucks the oxygen out of the story of Reconstruction, and everybody focuses on it. But then at the end of serving 2 terms as governor, Brownlow saw an opportunity, went off to the United States Senate, and there was an opening. Who would fill that vacuum? Well, the Tennessee Constitution had a clear answer for that. It was the Speaker of the Senate back then. And who was the Speaker of the Senate in 1869 when Brownlow left? DeWitt Clinton. It's like at this point he just appears in the history of Tennessee. He's a young fella. Many people don't even know what his age is, and we'll talk about that in a minute. There's a lot of mysteries about Center in the historical record. He's a young man. I know he's 39 at this point from the research. And he's already elevated to this significant position. That should tell you something about this man. He's somebody we need to know a little bit more about. But in the historical record, he's the Speaker of the Senate. He becomes the heir apparent to Brownlow's regime as now the new interim governor until an election is held and he becomes would be an official win governor in his outright, which he would later in 1869. But Center comes in and suddenly he just starts giving the vote out. You can have a vote. You can have a vote. Everybody can have a vote. Giving the vote to those who had been disfranchised by Brownlow, those opponents who had been Unionists, but more importantly, rebels, those who had fought for the Confederacy, those who had sympathized with the Confederacy. And suddenly Tennessee's politics are turned upside down from Republican rule, radical Republican rule, Brownlow's rule, to the restoration of the Democratic Party back in Tennessee, which would be a mainstay in Tennessee politics for quite some time, well into the 20th century. But Center there's more to him. And again, the reason there's not much to say about him that historians have is because they quite frankly have focused on Brownlow, and I get that. It's hard work when you got to go into the archives and dig up this story to find out more about Center. But that's what I did for my dissertation. And let me just start out. We'll start working our way up chronologically with Center. There's a lot of questions about when and where was this guy born. You can look at his obituaries. They'll place him in the counties of Ray, being born in Ray, Roane, Hawkins, Granger, and McMinn County. They'll place him as born in 1830, 1831, 1832, 1834. Heck, if you look at road signs, I've got right in the middle there, in Morristown, where his home was, it's now a used car lot, there's a sign which says clearly in Morristown that he was born in Ray County. They've even got some of his years in service wrong in Tennessee politics, which should be a no-brainer. It should be easy to look up. In Granger County, there's a state marker, a Tennessee state marker. Well, there was until recently. I think a drunk driver took it out several months ago. They haven't replaced it, or wasn't replaced when I was there a month ago. In Granger County, they tell you, Center is a native of Granger County. Born in Granger County, okay. You look at the histories written by the state historians, they can't even agree. Why is this confusion? His father, William Tandy Center Sr. He was a circuit riding Methodist preacher. So he was all over East Tennessee. And lo and behold, his family was constantly being uprooted. So you can find some sources, and there he is. But you can't just look at one source. You can't even look at two sources sometimes, as some people do. You got to dig deeper. And then you start seeing all these other things. So why is he in Ray County, for example? Why do they put him in Ray County? Well, William Tandy Center, in addition to be a circuit-riding Methodist preacher, was also a farmer. And like many preachers in the 19th century, dabbled in politics. Our own Parson Brownlow was a politician / minister, mostly politician. Center was active in politics, prominent among the early Whigs in Tennessee, those who challenged Jackson's Democratic Party. Whigs, and I'll go ahead and talk about this a little bit because this is important. They looked at government not as necessarily a danger, that government could be, if elected with responsible people, could be a vehicle for positive change for the people. Government, you need government, and you need a little bit, you need some funding for big projects like infrastructure, internal improvements, roads, bridges, clearing those rivers, obstructions, and building railroads. DeWitt Clinton Center. DeWitt Clinton. His very name comes from one of the most prominent Whigs, or I guess he was becoming a Whig. I defer to Dr. Feller for that, to be more specific on that. But
pre-Whig.
Pre-Whig, I like that, because the Whig Party wasn't nationally formed at that point. And DeWitt Clinton, from a prominent New York politician, was responsible for, at that point, building the biggest internal improvement project, the Erie Canal, or overseeing it. I don't think he built it, but he oversaw it and sponsored it. DeWitt Clinton's name comes from that. It shows you how William Tandy thought about DeWitt Clinton and thought about politics. William Tandy served in the 1834 Tennessee Constitutional Convention, representing Ray County. That's one reason people say, oh, he's from Ray County Center. 1830s, he's born right around that period. He's serving in the State Constitutional Convention representing Ray at that time. He also appears in the census list for 1833 in Ray County. Okay, there we go. He's Ray County. What about Roane County? Well, he's Roane County because there's evidence that they lived there. There's in 1831. There was a home still standing when Center dies in 1898. The locals pinpoint it where it was, and they go there and they write about it. And so he's in Roane County. Hawkins County. The family lived there in the 1840s. There's a census record that proves that. So some people went with Hawkins. Granger. He lived his retirement years there. He lived a long time, so people say, lives in Granger. Where and when? McMinn County. This is where he was born. He was born on March 26, 1830. One interesting thing is, if you look at the record, they may have different years, 30, 31, 32, 34, but they all say March of 26. Every account says March 26, so we got that nailed down. This is the 1830 census. And I've highlighted at the bottom, that is his father, William Tandy Center. And I've got that mark 1 under the age of 5. In the 1830 census, the census takers, it starts on June the 1st, 1830, and they ran until June the 1st, 1831. But during that entire year, census takers were to identify who lived where as of June the 1st, 1830. And there it is, 2-month-old, firstborn, DeWitt Clinton Center, marked by that little mark right there. McMinn County. There's one proof. And in the 1940s, I don't know if he was mayor yet, George Dempster of Knoxville. Was it Dumpsters or something like that? I've been around a while, but not that long. Dempster, who was an armchair historian, loved to write history articles for the newspaper, wrote this article about DeWitt Clinton Center, and in it he said he was born in Granger County. Well, a gentleman named William H. Thomas in Athens, Tennessee, didn't like that. He wrote an article to the editor of the journal and said, Mr. Dempster's completely wrong. Oral history. There's lots of us here in McMinn County know that he was born here in McMinn County, and we can even place where he was born. Now, I'm not that familiar with McMinn County, but it was about 8 miles northwest of Athens in a Pond Hill community. And I spoke to McMinn County Historical Society back in the spring, and there were people there saying, oh, yes, we do know about this, and we know exactly the area. That's correct. So oral history. So we've got to rely on some sources. But I like this one here, the 1830 census, which really nails it down to where he's born. So March 26, 1830, happy birthday, DeWitt Clinton Center. He is 39 years old when he becomes governor. He's 37 when he becomes Speaker of the Senate. That's a young fella. Must have been doing something right. It is a meteoric rise of Center. His family, well, we've talked about his father, prominent politician, farmer, minister. His mom, Nancy White, her father was a prominent Methodist minister. Religion had to be important to his life, I'm sure. But he didn't go down that path. His father, William Tandy Center, died in 1848, right after his 18th birthday. At that point, he had decided he was going off to school to be a lawyer. He attended Strawberry Plains College in Jefferson County and immediately went in to begin reading law. Now, something happened a few years after that. He just gave it up. Again, the record is very ambiguous. It's not clear. We don't have much sources. But he soon begins helping his mother, Nancy, on their farm in Granger County in the 1850s is where they're living. And the Centers had a flour grist mill. They were prominent, well-to-do, and they owned, in the 1850 census, they owned slaves. They had 5. In the 1860 census, it shows they had 7 slaves. So, this isn't Gone with the Wind Tar here. This isn't Monticello with hundreds of slaves. But, 7 slaves. They had a pretty good-sized farm, and were doing well financially. In the mid-1850s, Center begins to take up politics. And in 1857, he is elected to represent Granger County in the General Assembly. His politics, he's a Whig. He challenges the Democratic Party. He is a strong supporter of internal improvements. His vision of Tennessee was very much Henry Clay's vision, his American plan. It was a diversified economy, building up the industry here in Tennessee, pushing for economic progress. Center, make sure, I talked about slavery. He's a proponent of slavery, supporter, and that's not unusual among Whigs. And he will argue in the lead up to the American Civil War, as there's agitation over this slavery question, is that we in the South, as Southern states begin the discussion of dissolving the relationship to the Union, federal Union, is that slavery is best preserved in the Union. This was an argument that East Tennessee Whigs did make, Brownlow especially one of them, and he was despite his policies, was no proponent of social equality in that respect. Let me make a quick mention of his wife. She is really, there's not much to say about her in the historical record, or historians have said. He married his cousin, Harriet Center, whose father was a very prominent General P.M. Center of Rutledge, Tennessee, and a soldier who fought alongside Zachary Taylor in Florida in the Indian Wars, fought alongside Winfield Scott in the Mexican-American War, a first lieutenant with the 5th Infantry Regiment of the U.S. Army. Interestingly, a staunch Democrat. That Harriet comes from a Democratic family, marrying her cousin, DeWitt Clinton Center, a staunch Whig. Now, in 1861, the Civil War, well, hang on.
You're good.
I'm good? Okay.
It's just loose.
I was told not to move. And when I teach, I move. I love to move around the room and talk with my hands and everything. And it's hard to stay confined to a podium. When the Civil War began, DeWitt Clinton Center, serving in the General Assembly, was a staunch Unionist from the get-go. As a matter of fact, in January 18th, 1861, he went onto the floor of the Capitol and declared again, the rights, the interest, and honor of Tennessee can only be preserved in the Union. He fought against secession, went out speaking across the state, speaking against secession. And when the war came, when Tennessee seceded in June of 1861, he did not leave the legislature. Now, if you know the story about the United States Congress, the House, the Senate, when the southern states seceded, they all left. Except for, most prominently, an East Tennessean from Greenville, Tennessee, Andrew Johnson. Center's kind of like Andrew Johnson here in this case. He's the only Unionist who remained. That will cause him some problems later in his political career of his own party, those who were jealous of his rise to power so quick. Those who sought to get rid of him would try to use that against him, that he had served in the rebel legislature, because he followed the legislature out of Nashville when the Union Army comes strolling in, out to Memphis. And he stayed with the legislature until it adjourned in March 20th, 1862. His argument that he made then and he made later was, I stayed because the voters of Granger County elected me to office, and I'm here to represent the Unionist voice. His fellow rebel colleagues in the rebel legislature did not like him. And when he left, when the legislature adjourned in March 1862, he made his way back home to Granger County. But in 1862, it's one of these stories. East Tennessee is known as the staunch Unionist, Middle and West Tennessee, those who supported the Confederacy. But on the battlefield, you just flip that. For the first 2 years of the war, the Union eventually controls, or largely controls, Middle and West Tennessee, and the Confederates have control of East Tennessee. So when he arrived home in the spring of 1862, the Confederates were waiting for him. They arrested him. I see Tyler Boyd over here. And he's written a fantastic book about Harry T. Byrne, and people have heard the story about Harry T. Byrne and the vote and running out the window. Center was escaping out his own window when the Confederates came around and caught him going out the back window. He was arrested. For 6 months, he was moved around with various Confederate regiments, put into prison. He eventually posted bond. It says $4,000. That's staggering. 1862, $4,000. He then left and went to Louisville, Kentucky, my hometown, where he spent about the next 2 years of the Civil War. In 1864, he returned back home to East Tennessee, when East Tennessee had now been largely pacified of rebel troops. Not that the rebel troops were completely out of East Tennessee. They still would plague some problems for Union soldiers into 1865. But he came back. He was a presidential elector on the Abraham Lincoln Andrew Johnson Union ticket. the only time the Republican Party abandoned their name in 1864. I ran on the Union ticket to stress Union as trying to bring Andrew Johnson on, a Democrat from a southern state, to show that Lincoln was ready to work and bring back the states. In 1865, when the state government is restored or reconstituted, the Unionists, now the victors, create their government, install William Brownlow as governor. Center is elected back to the state legislature, but this time, going to the General Assembly, he's not going to the House, he's going to the Senate. He's sort of got some attention for being this sort of Unionist voice, kind of like I said, Andrew Johnson in the U.S. Senate during the beginning of the Civil War. Being arrested, that kind of added to his resume, kind of his street cred with this now Republican Party. He was elected to the state Senate in 1865. Now, real quick, I must talk about this because politics, the labels here. Did it go out again?
No.
Okay. I thought I heard something. My foot is like literally where I'm trying not to step on it. The Unionist. There are two variants of Unionists during the Civil War. We have the unconditional and the conditional. Center is an unconditional Unionist. That is someone who supported the Union from the get-go. They supported Abraham Lincoln, all of his policies, straight on down through emancipation. Maybe sometimes they were a little reluctant, but they supported publicly, and that's important with Center here. Publicly, he toed the line, the party line. There are conditional Unionists, those who came out for Union at the beginning. The war was being fought to preserve the Union. They were gung-ho for that. But when Lincoln's administration started issuing policies of a questionable constitutional nature, suspending the writ of habeas corpus, eventually his Emancipation Proclamation, they didn't sign up for some of this stuff. And so these conditional Unionists began to break with the administration. And during Brownlow's administration, when he comes in, these unconditional Unionists, those who were always on the boat, are going to be these, we're going to style Republicans. Historians of a bygone era call these Brownlow's radical Republicans. And Center's going to get that label. Although we'll look at, does he really deserve that label? The conditional Unionists, those who sort of broke with the administration, and those who will break with Brownlow's policies, they're going to be called conservatives going into this period. Do not mistake conservative Republicans with anything today, okay? We're going to talk about in the post-Civil War period, Brownlow's radical Republicans, Center's public face is there, and the conditional Unionists who are going to become the conservatives. Now, once he gets into office as a state senator, Center's towing the party line. The ballot box, disfranchising the Confederates, Center's there. He really doesn't like the Confederates. Go figure. They had him arrested. And later, letters he'll write later on in his gubernatorial career, he tells you in the letters he really hates the Confederacy in very clear language. So he's on board with disfranchising Confederates. As the party moves on and his opponents start to develop within the Republican Party, these conservatives, Brownlow begins to disfranchise them. He's on board with that. He's towing the party line. In 1867, when Brownlow's party enfranchises African Americans, interestingly, Center tries to push back. He says on the issue of suffrage, giving the right to African Americans, there is trouble in this question, and if introduced, it will shake this body from its center to its circumference. You will go too far, mark it. Just as the secessionists went too far in 1861, give us time and soon we shall catch up with the tone of public opinion. The Union Party needs all the strengthening it can get. This was a bold statement to make. Now at this point, he's just a state senator. He's not speaker. He's not the leader of the party in the General Assembly. But it's a pretty bold statement. He even goes on to say, I'd prefer not giving the right to vote to African Americans. I'm in favor of colonization. Colonization is the idea, is the acknowledgement, we got a race problem in this country. That we need to, if freed, African Americans need to be sent, some would say, back home. They knew what that meant. And colonization is not really an idea people are publicly floating once you get past emancipation becoming the talking points of the Republican Party with Lincoln in 1863 in his proclamation. Center's bringing this up in 1865, that he's in favor of colonization. So on the race question, Center is not very progressive, not in the mode we would think of these radical Republicans. But when it comes to the vote, he does support it. He toes the line. That tells me something. I think he's very ambitious. And I have to assume, which is always a dangerous thing to do, we have to assume with what the evidence we have, Center is ambitious. Wants to stay in good with the party. Yes, he voices his opposition and says things that doesn't toe the line. But when the vote comes, he's there. He's supporting. In 1867, Brownlow's up for re-election. It's a referendum on Brownlow. And some Republicans had been itching to get into positions of power, and they thought, Brownlow's, decrepit. Look at him. He looks like he's dead. He'll go away. He doesn't. He wants reelected. And some of these Republicans in the party are angry because they want to advance. Brownlow gets reelected in 67, and then there's a contest for the U.S. Senate, which is under very different rules back then. The legislatures appoint the United States senators, unlike today. We have a vote. And suddenly, after winning re-election, Brownlow says, I want to go to U.S. Senate. There's a vacancy. I think it was the stepson of Andrew Johnson, who was in the U.S. Senate, had left the Senate, so there was a vacancy in Tennessee. David Patterson, I believe. And William Stokes, representative, congressman of Tennessee, from Middle Tennessee, wants to run for the Senate. And all of a sudden, Brownlow says, I want to run. This causes animosity in the party, and the Republican Party really breaks at this point. Center backs Brownlow. Publicly backs him. And after Brownlow gets the nod, goes to the U.S. Senate, Brownlow has it that Center is to be appointed the Speaker of the Senate, becoming the number 2 man in Tennessee, or in the General Assembly, the leader of the party. He's immediately, at age 37, becomes the Speaker. Now, that election was in 1867. Brownlow will finish out his 2-year gubernatorial term because that vacancy it won't take seat until 1869. But when Brownlow finally leaves Tennessee and departs, and Center now assumes the governorship, Brownlow's happy. He says, my regrets on retiring would be greater were it not that the gentleman who will succeed me is a loyal man, capable, tried, and trusty, who is sound in his principles, and who will steadfastly adhere to them upon the platform of the Union Republican Party in Tennessee. Center's a loyal man, steadfast in his principles. The moment Center comes in, he wants to start building a new Republican Party, a party of the center, not to be attributed with Brownlow in this sort of extreme side. Center is of a group of Republicans, young at the end of the Civil War, especially in the South, who realized if you want to build a Southern Republican Party, you're going to have to appeal to those who have been supporters of the Democratic Party. And knowing that at this point they're still disfranchised, he's going to try to begin to use to his advantage some time to build this party of the center. He comes in, he immediately relaxes martial law, disbands Brownlow's state militia. which had been out hunting up the Ku Klux Klan, which had been out policing the ballot box. He starts handing out political posts, using the power of the patronage, judicial posts to conservatives, those who had broke with Brownlow's party long ago. Starts filling the judgeships here with conservatives. He comes in and says, I have the hope we're going to restore Tennessee to fiscal responsibility, while also promoting expensive internal improvement projects, but that's going to help us in the long term financially. He's got grand ideas to build this political party in the center. He's got a good friend in one of the state Supreme Court justices. Tennessee has 3 Supreme Court justices. They've all been breaking with Brownlow. They've got questions about the constitutionality of some of his policies. And Judge Shackelford of the state Supreme Court is a frequent visitor at Center's place. When Center's in Nashville, he has a little place above William Barry's bookstore, a very famous bookstore in the public square in the shadow of the Capitol. And the newspaper picks up on this, that the Judge Shackelford's meeting with Center. Also are some other people, all people who had been breaking with Brownlow, conservatives. And Shackelford starts telling Center that we've got some things in the pipeline, on the docket, that might be important to note. One of them is a case called State v. Stanton. It's a case that involved a former Confederate voting in Gibson County in 1867. He was arrested under Brownlow's orders for voting. He was a Confederate. Broke the law. In this case, Judge Shackelford tells Center, we're getting ready to rule. And here's what we're going to rule. The ruling is going to come down and say, well, Stanton was giving a voting certificate at the end of the American Civil War. As of 1865, any voting certificates that had been issued, were issued by Brownlow's commissioners of registration. He'd been given a valid voting certificate by accident, but he voted. The court came down and ruled and said, look, anyone who is given a valid voting certificate has a right to vote, and therefore cannot be disfranchised. This case, which has erroneously been argued by historians, the thing that flipped it all, is not really accurate, because the franchise law still did remain on the books. But what this did was it said anyone with a voting certificate. Well, guess what? A lot of conservatives had voting certificates. Those who had been unionists during the war. A lot of people had broke from Brownlow's Radical Republican Party but had been disfranchised, had voting certificates of 1865. Suddenly the newspapers say all these conservatives are going to be digging in their closets and in their drawers looking for their voting certificates. And anyone who had this could now vote. That all of a sudden meant approximately 30,000 conservatives could vote. Well, guess who starts doing the math? Center. He starts figuring out, wow, they're going to be able to vote. He starts to try to win them over. In the 1869 state election, well, look who's back up. William Stokes. He had been denied power, denied the opportunity to run for the U.S. Senate because Brownlow wanted it. Now he's running for the governorship against Center. And he's representing this staunch radical Republican Party. And now Center's like, I'll just go to a moderate type of centrist position here, and I'll win these conservatives. I'll start to win some of these radicals have broken off. And so the election turns on universal male suffrage. Who's going to do it first? Who's going to say, I'm coming out for all men age 21 and older, regardless of race, could vote? Stokes says, I'll do gradual universal male suffrage. That is, over time, we'll let these former Confederates, those who have been disfranchised, vote. Leaves it ambiguous. And there had always been this question of, at the very beginning when they disfranchised the former rebels across the South at the end of the war, there was always this question of how long should they stay disfranchised? 3 years, 5 years? Because the question was, the Unionists argued we need time to build up a loyal government, i.e. we need time to build up a Southern Republican Party. And so lo and behold, Stokes says we'll do gradual. Center comes out and says, you vote for me, I'm for universal male suffrage. Everyone can vote if you vote for me. And that just sucked the air out of Stokes real quick, because Center had an ace up his sleeve. He had Brownlow's election machinery. Under Brownlow's election machinery, those commissioners of registration were the key. Those are in the counties who could determine who could vote. Center decided, I'll just remove all those commissioners of registration and put in my own people who will see to it that conservatives and some reasonable former Confederates can vote. Those who could be brought to a centrist political party of the center. And he fired one of Brownlow's radical commissioners of registration in Shelby County and appointed what he said was a staunch Unionist who was actually a former Confederate, believe it or not. In the case of Williams versus Bogner, in the summer of 1869, Williams, who was the Brownlow appointee who had been fired, sued Bogner, who was Center's appointee, and said, he fired me, that's against the franchise law, it's against the laws of the state, and he's there enfranchising conservatives and rebels. Went to state Supreme Court. Those 3 justices, Shackelford, those justices who had long broke with Brownlow, they ruled in favor of Center and his commissioner of registration, and said that Bogner was in his full right to be issuing these voting certificates, because the commissioners, there's no tenure of office. It doesn't state that how long they have to stay in office. They serve at the interest of the governor of the state of Tennessee. And Center was able, through that, to get wholesale removal of commissioners of registration in all 84 counties in Tennessee. And those commissioners began enfranchising conservatives and even former rebels. So that in 1869, when the election was held, Center won outright. Now, for time's sake, I'm just going to wrap this up real quick. Center, once he becomes governor in his own outright in 1869, he thought he could bring the conservatives into his wing. They were thankful that he'd given them basically the right to vote, and that reasonable former Confederates and rebel sympathizers would also come in, and we'd work together, we'd rebuild Tennessee and move it forward. The conservatives, we don't trust them. He's wishy-washy. And they had started to move over more to aligning with Democrats. More of a moderate Democrat, shall I say, but they were moving into what will become the Democratic Party in Tennessee. And they didn't want anything to do with Center. In that election, at the very end of that election, the state election, not only did Center win, but when the conservatives started getting the right to vote, they suddenly started jumping into electoral races. They won the state legislature, the House, the Senate, and in 1869, the conservative legislature just basically started overhauling all of Brownlow's laws. They pushed for a state constitutional convention, which in 1870 met in the winter of 1870, and got rid of the final act of Brownlowism, his franchise laws, and basically said the right to vote is for all Tennesseans, 21 and older males, regardless of race. That became a question. Once they got in the convention, they almost tried to throw out black suffrage, which eventually wiser heads from the Democratic Party came to it and said, no, we can't do that. That might bring the federal government into Tennessee. Cause some problems. But lo and behold, Center was, there are letters up here on the 3rd floor of McClung, T.A.R. Nelson papers and the Leonidas Houck papers, in which Center is just venting that I tried my best to work to form a centrist party, and they lied to me. They went against me. I'll never cooperate with this rebel, defunct Democratic Party. In that 1870 Constitution, they rewrote the schedule of Tennessee's elections, and they made an election in 1870, that August, immediately, a new governor, because they wanted to get rid of center. They wanted to get rid of Republicans. And in 1870, they elected a former Confederate, John C. Brown, a Ku Klux Klan member, a Confederate general, governor of the state of Tennessee. And center finished out his remaining months miserable. He left the office, went back to his home, now settling in Morristown, Tennessee. Spent the rest of his years as a farmer. Republicans didn't want to touch him. Democrats didn't want to touch him. Nobody trusted him. Spent his years as a farmer. People tried to get him every now and then to come out and give speeches. He didn't want to do it. He was just frustrated. Young man. His career blossomed at such an early age, and at 41 he was done. And spent the remaining years of his life basically quite ill. Lucky to live another almost 30 years, till 1898 when he passed away. That's a lot more that's ever been said about center. It's ever been said about from any other historian. Happy to take any questions you may have. Yes.
Concerning the controversy about where and when he was born, were you ever able to find a family Bible that had been handed down?
No. And I've been, like, where are some, like, there's got to be a trunk somewhere with center papers, or maybe like the Brownlow papers years ago on Gay Street when they were doing renovations, they found it in a wall. Somewhere there's got to be this stash. I just think center burned everything like a lot of politicians did. It's sad that there's just not that much information. Now, Tyler over here is with the McMinn County Historical Society, and when we talked, it was really an eye-opening that your members, people there, sort of knew the sort of the oral history that's continued to this day. That I found in the newspaper. I was like, oh, this is great. And then I go there and speak, and I'm like, no, we're still telling this story. And we know where they are. But no, I wish there was a family Bible. Yeah. I think he just detached from politics, probably just burned it. And the only reason we have these governor papers is because that has to be kept, and that's in Nashville.
What did Brownlow think of center during his senatorial career?
Good question. So during my dissertation research, Brownlow, they put a lot of faith in him, publicly spoken up in his favor, and when Brownlow goes off to the U.S. Senate, his real voice is his son, John B. Brownlow, who takes over basically the Knoxville Whig. And if you look at the papers of the Brownlow, the official papers, Brownlow writes on the margins of the paper. John Bell Brownlow writes on the margin of the papers. And in those margins, you get what the Brownlows feel about everybody. And they're very clear. And John Bell Brownlow usually writes in the margins about those editorial page, which was page 2, I believe, of the Whig usually. And so he writes on the margins. But looking at the microfilm, I'm looking there, I'm like, what is that? This is the microfilm copy of the Knoxville Whig. These are the personal Brownlow collection. It's in Washington, D.C. in the Library of Congress. And it's been there, I think, since the mid-1930s. I started saying, what is that off to the right? They're scribbling, and that doesn't look like, that's not the newspaper. And so I wrote the Library of Congress, and I said, can I please get a copy of it? Can I request it? I'll come up to D.C. and look at it. They're like, sorry, we're doing renovations. It's going up to Fort Meade or something like in Maryland, and they're not going to be accessible for 2 years. So I wrote them, and I said, look, you've got to get this copy pulled. There's a document in there. And so after about a year, I get a message from the head of the newspaper and says, how in the heck did you know there was a document in there? So I looked at the microfilm, I could see it. So they sent me back one document and then one 4-page document. And here's what we find in here. The Brownlows tell us exactly how they feel about center. Center has towed the party line. He's fought for my election to the 1867 gubernatorial, win the governorship, and fought for me for the U.S. Senate. Publicly, he supported me. And John Bell Brownlow, his son, was under investigation for corruption, stealing from the school fund, which Center covered up as Speaker of the Senate. They're thankful for Center. But he's betrayed their trust, betrayed the party. So what do we get here? This fellow right here is Horace Maynard. The Centers were working in the background while publicly saying we support Center to get Maynard to run for governor, to oppose Stokes. But Maynard did not want to run against his fellow congressmen. They were both congressmen at the time. And he fancied a U.S. Senate seat. He didn't want to get involved in Tennessee politics. He wanted to be in Washington. And so the Brownlows were working behind the scenes to manipulate things, and they were just going to bring Maynard in and oust Center. And Maynard didn't do it. Publicly, the Brownlows still had to support Center. So if you look at John Brownlow's papers, he writes back very negative about Center, for basically betraying his father's trust, his and his father's trust. Yeah, this was a fun thing. I just remember one day I finally got an email out of the blue after thinking they weren't going to ever answer me. And the head of the newspaper says, "How on earth did you know this?" So I can see it on the microfilm. Good question.
Good answer.
Thank you.
Where's Center buried?
Center is, well, this is a good thing. All right, Center. So we got a picture. I have pretty pictures, lots. I can talk forever unless somebody cuts me off. He dies in 1898. They don't really have a proper stone or anything, a marker at this moment. And so they bury him in the city cemetery there in Morristown. While they're getting a nice, beautiful red like marble obelisk here. And I think it was about 2 or 3 years later, they finally get this installed at Jarnigan Cemetery in Morristown. And so this is his marker. It's pretty impressive. It really stands out in the cemetery. You go in, you can see it. Most of them are all small markers and such, and there he is in sort of the back of the cemetery. And that's another thing. He's in Morristown, so I guess he was born in Morristown, you know? People think, oh, he's lived his whole life in Morristown. Any other questions? Oh, sorry, I saw an arm. All right. Well, thank you so much for coming today.